Ahoy there, YouTube! I'm back again today for another oh-so-delicious list, and today I'm really excited because I see all sorts of lists talking about the best game designers of all time, but it got me wondering, who are the worst game designers of all time? Now, obviously, this is not going to be a subjective list where I pick my least favorite designers because that would be ridiculous because there are tens of thousands of games on BoardGameGeek.com, which is pretty much the only board game website that matters. However, there's a certain number called the Board Game Rank, and that number is accumulated by all the people who have rated board games in the past. So essentially, you could put your rating there, and then if you get to a certain number of ratings, you officially get entered into the Board Game Rank as long as you're not an expansion. So, how I decided to do this was I decided to go all the way to the very bottom of that list. Right now, it currently ends at 24,616, with Tic-Tac-Toe being the worst game of all time. At least one that's gotten enough ratings. Now, what I decided to do is make the cutoff 20,000. So every single game from 20,000 to 24,601, I took a look at the designer, and then I checked out all the games they designed and saw who had the most games in the bottom of the games that have been ranked on Board Game Geek, and I'm bringing the top 10 to you. Now, I did put a couple caveats in here. We're not going to be talking about games that just had a whole boatload of spin-offs, like they made one crappy game, then they have, like, Golden Girls this game and Jurassic Park this game. Also, I decided to weed out a bunch of mass market crap, war games, and really focus on hobby games because that's what I primarily cover on this channel. That being said, I found a lot of other interesting game designers who I'm going to be mentioning as honorable mentions as we progress through the list. Last thing I want to mention is that a lot of these game designers, some of them you're going to be shocked at, and it'll make sense as we go. Just because you're on this list doesn't necessarily mean they're a terrible game designer. It just means they've made so many games that some of them kind of sucked. And also, Board Game Geek tend to be a little bit snooty, the people do sometimes. And so children's games, family games, and war games a lot of the time will be lower rated than other games. But enough with the wind-up. Let's get in with two honorable mentions. So first I have R. Hunter Goed, who between 2000 and 2002 released 4 games, and all 4 of those games are in the bottom 20,000. They were really not the best at designing games. And you're like, well, that doesn't seem that impressive. Well, here's the thing. As I went through this entire list of over 4,000 games, what I realized was there's a lot of people with 1 game in the bottom 20,000 and then they'd quit making games. A lot of people with 2 potentially, but I didn't see anybody with 3, and R. Hunter is the only person with 4 games in the bottom 5,000. So he wins the award for most consistently worse, even though I think if I do a follow-up list, say in like 10 years, he's going to be bumped off this list by someone a little bit later. But that's called foreshadowing. So, moving on to our second honorable mention, we have the worst female game designer of all time, and that's Carrie Breitenstein, who actually has probably sold millions of copies of her games, but she has made 20 games that have reached the Board Game Geek ranking, and 11 of them are in the bottom 5K. So really, more than half of them, people are like, yeah, we could take it or we could leave it. However, she's most well known for the Zombies franchise, which has spun off like 50 billion expansions, it feels like, and she only has 1 game in the top 8,000 period, and that's Zombies, which a lot of nostalgia. I personally still enjoy the game, but she unfortunately did not make the cutoff to be on the top 10 worst game designers of all time, even though she was very close, because When Darkness Comes is currently sitting at 19,440. So within a year or two, she will probably get bumped down there. But for the time being, no women on the list. It's a bunch of white dudes, which, yeah, I mean, you're probably not surprised. But speaking of white dudes, let's get to our first old white dude, and we have Steve Jackson of Steve Jackson Games Fan. And as you can see immediately from 2 of the first 3 people, just because you're on this list does not mean you are not very successful, because Steve Jackson Games has done a grand total of 73 games that have been ranked on Board Game Geek, and 12 of them are in the bottom 5,000. However, 12 of them are also in the top 4,000. So he has some very much beloved games as well. In particular, I got a soft spot in my heart for Zombie Dice and Munchkin, which were 2 of my gateway games getting into the hobby. And this is one thing that you'll notice, is that game design has evolved over time, and when you're really starting to look at games from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, heck, even the early 2000s, they generally, for the most part, just don't age well. And you're going to see a lot of that as we progress through the list. But our number 10, with 12 games in the bottom, we'll just say 5,000, it's like 4,600, is Steve Jackson of Steve Jackson Games. Congratulations. Moving on to number 9, and who I do believe might actually be one of my favorite designers of all time. He's easily in my top 5. That's Bruno Faidutti. And I was a little bit, my heart hurt a little bit when I put him on here, but he's had 12 games that are in the bottom 20,000 out of 77, so it's still a pretty good ratio. And but he does have 5 in the top 1,000 of all time and 19 games in the top 3,000 of all time. So saying that he's, the 9th worst game designer of all time is kind of ridiculous, but looking based on just this metric of where you rank with a bunch of your games like Halloween Party and Jungle and Smiley Face, which I think we're all shocked that one wasn't a big hit. He is sitting in a 3-way tie for 10th, 9th, and 8th. Still a fantastic designer, and I'll give a huge shout out. Every time I go through one of these designers and I know one of their games and love it, I want to give a big shout out to Boomtown, which is one of my favorite games of all time. You should check that game out if you've never played it. But the number 9 on this list, Bruno Faidutti. Continuing on to number 8, and who I actually think you could, if you're really pulling teeth here and said, who do you think of these people on this list is the worst game designer of all time? It might be Mark Steer right here. Now, Mark Steer has made a grand total of 14 games that have been ranked on BoardGameGeek, and a very astounding 12 of them are in the bottom 5,000. And so that's really, really bad. And his top rated game of all time is only sitting at 18,663. Now, I've never played any of these games. Abstract strategy games are just not really my jam. But I gotta give it up for Mark just for consistently just continuing to put out game after game after game after game, despite the fact, people... There doesn't really seem to be a huge market or audience for the games, unfortunately, as the people who are getting them are not rating them particularly high. And I would not be surprised, because I don't think he's made a game in a while. Let's check this out. If he eventually took and knocked our Hunter Go, remember this guy who went 4 for 4 off the list, because I wouldn't be surprised. No, he's still putting out games. Still striving. Hopefully he'll get there, but I wouldn't be surprised if eventually all of his games were in the bottom 20,000, at least of the 2 that we talked about who were not in the bottom 20,000 currently. So, there you go. We had a 3-way tie. Steve Jackson, Bruno Faidutti, and Mark Steer for 10th, 9th, and 8th. Moving on, we've got Leo Calavini, who has 13 games in the bottom 5,000 games on BoardGameGeek out of 65. So he's done quite a lot of games. And also, once again, he's kind of a made man, despite the fact he has some real dregs down here. He has 8 games in the top 3,000, which is really impressive. Like, that's pretty dang good. And you'll see on this list, when you make really good games like that are highly rated, like Incognito, I think is a great game, you'll get people reaching out to you to like collaborate on games and work on games, and I feel like that's a lot of the time when you hit those bottom 20,000 games where it's like, yeah, my name's attached to it, but it wasn't really my baby. Or maybe I'm just trying to give people too much benefit of the doubt. But anywho, our number 7 on this list is Leo Calavini. Moving on to number 6, we have Michael Schacht. Now, Michael Schacht has done a whole bunch of different stuff. He's done gamer games. He's done kids' weight games. Crazy Creatures of Dr. Gloom. That's not a particularly great game. But he has 13 games in the bottom 5,000 out of 87 games that are ranked on BoardGameGeek. And once again, that doesn't mean that they've made 87 games. They actually potentially have made more, and they just didn't get enough rankings on BoardGameGeek. But still, 13 out of 87. And once again, he's won the Spiel, so he's kind of a made man. The Spiel is Yours, which is one of the biggest gaming design awards of all time. He's got Coloretto, Zularetto, 2 of the top 1,000 games of all time. And he's got 8 games in the top 2,000. So, once again, take the name of this list with a grain of salt. Because once again, I didn't really know what to name this, aside from the worst games designers of all time, because based on this metric, that's kind of how it works. Now, let's get to our next honorable mention, and this award goes for the worst design group ever, and that goes to Terry Miller Associates. And if you have a beloved IP, there's a good chance they probably ruined one of the games with Rose Art on this one. So they have 15 games that they've made that have been ranked, and 13 of them are in the bottom 5,000. So they really not doing too well. But as you can see, Ruin sitting at the 19,932. So within months, that one could quite literally dip down there, and then he'd be 14 out of 15 in the bottom 5,000. Trivial Pursuit, the Big Bang Theory edition, dragging up that ratio though. But they sucked, so Prospero Hall could kind of run, I guess, and it's really disappointing because, they got a lot of great IPs. The Simpsons, The Da Vinci Code, Friends, The Hobbit, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Lord of the Rings. Look at this. They have a Lord of the Rings game that is one of the lowest ranked games of all time. Actually, they have two of the lowest ranked Lord of the Rings games of all time, even though there is one other one, The Search, which really sucks. Oh my gosh, I reviewed that. It was so bad. But yeah, it's just disappointing. And when it's a group, like when they put it out, they know it had to not be great, right? Yeah, it's disappointing. That being said, I have played the Da Vinci Code board game. It's an interesting little game. And Battleship Command, I would fight you on the street. I would say that's one of my favorite battleships of all time. It has this really cool mechanism where it's like, check this out. It's like layers. It's really kind of a cool game. And that, once again, was a little bit of the biases that I was talking about at the beginning of this video where like, oh, board game gamers, we put our nose up to the snooty Milton Bradley games. So, like I said, take all this with a grain of salt. I'm just really fascinated about this sort of thing. Why is Kakarlakak sitting here? Oh, that's why, because that brings us to Gunter Bars, our next honorable mention, who is the worst children's game designer of all time, which once again, take that with a grain of salt. We're just looking at the numbers, strictly the numbers, but they've done 29 games that are ranked on BoardGameGeek, and nearly half of them, sitting at 14 out of the 29, are in the bottom 5,000. And Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and Chuck It Chicken, look at those. Those are close. Blackrock Castle, oh my gosh, we got quite a few of these sitting there just teetering at the 19,000, 20,000 range. So we could easily be looking at, 18 out of 29 in the bottom? Anywho, so they do have one game in the top 10,000, which is not great. And, 4 games in the 19,000. So the worst children's game designer of all time. And I have played a couple of these games, and they're not great. But once again, children's games on BoardGameGeek, they tend to get rated a little bit lower, which is kind of unfortunate, especially considering I'm a bit of a children's game connoisseur. Continuing onward to the number 5, we have Michael Stacria, who honestly, okay, so I put a little bit earlier who I thought might actually be the worst board game designer of all time, looking at the numbers, but Michael Stacria is probably a very distant, or a very close second. So Michael has 15 games that are currently ranked on BoardGameGeek, and 14 of them are in the bottom 5,000. And his top-rated game is Pirates 2nd Edition, which is sitting at 16,136. Now, the good news is that I imagine, since it's a 2nd edition, that they improved upon the game, and that's why it's actually higher than that. But he got the Witcher Adventure game. Like, who handed this guy that? Like, yeah, so he's close to one of the worst game designers ever, at least based on these metrics. And because I always like to look at the numbers too. If you have 14 games in the bottom 5,000 and you've made 15 games, that's way different than if you have 14 games in the bottom 5,000 and you've made 40 games, So I would say consistently, Michael Stacria definitely on the Mount Rushmore, I would think, of bad game designers, which is cool to know, because did you know that before? No, I didn't. Continuing onward, we have what many people will say is kind of sacrilegious. One of the greatest game designers of all time, the late, the great Wolfgang Kramer. But yeah, he's on here. He's made 141 games, which is just a stupidly large number for now. And 15 of them are in the bottom 5K, which I gotta say, that's a pretty good ratio. Once again, Michael Stacria has made 15 games and 14 of them are in the bottom 5,000. Wolfgang Kramer has made 141 and 15 of them are down there. But once again, he's a made man. Just period. He's won the Spiel 5 times. The Spiel des Jahres 5 times, which is the most ever by any game designer ever. He's got 1 game in the top 100, which is incredibly rarefied air. 11 in the top 1,000. He's got a penthouse apartment in the top 1,000. And 50 games in the top 4,000 of all time, which is that's astonishing. That's amazing. Just absolutely incredible. Best known for, I would say, probably El Grande, which is still, to this day, it stands the test of time. Downforce got released. Coliseum's a great game. Six Nymphs a great game. Just banger after banger after banger after banger. But once again, You throw it off crap at the wall, some of it's going to be crap. And I wonder with a lot of these, just how many of them was just like a bad rule booklet or components or something like that ruined it for the game. All right, so number 4, Wolfgang Kramer with 15 games in the bottom 5,000. But now we've got 2 more honorable mentions. Next, we have Cephas Howard, who I am awarding the one-trick worst game designer of all time because he made this game called Creationary, which was a Lego game with Lego components. And then he proceeded to make 27 other games, all just focused around Legos. And people just slowly started to hate them, or they started to get worse, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, 17 of the 28 games that he made are in the bottom 5,000. His highest rated game was his first game, as mentioned, which was at 5,900 with Creationary. And I wonder how much of that was just people like, whoa, this is a really cool idea. And then they didn't build on that really cool idea enough, and instead they just slapped intellectual properties to it. I don't know. Honorable mention, though. One trick, worst game designer goes to Cephas Howard. Big ups. And once again, he's probably sold millions and millions of copies of these Lego games. So just because you're on this list doesn't mean you're not, not banking on your games. Continuing on with another honorable mention, we have the Wargamer Reiner Knizia, worst war game designer of all time. He has 99 games. That is Jim Dunnigan. Let me rephrase that. 99 games that are rated on BoardGameGeek, and 17 of them are in the bottom 5,000. 2 of them are in the top 3,000. And once again, I didn't put them on the list because, this is war games, and who the hell cares, Probably not you, so moving onward. Moving on to number 3, we have Alex Randolph, who has made 56 games that are on the BoardGameGeek database as ranked, and 19 of them are in the bottom 5K. However, he does have 5 games in the top 3,000. And he does a really wide variety of games. He kind of felt like a poor man's Reiner Knizia to me. And honestly, if I did this list, say, 10, 15 years earlier, I imagine he would not be on this list just because he has a lot of games like 1962, 1988, 1980, 1974, which those games don't typically age that well, but some of his definitely still do. And so big ups to Alex Randolph, probably the late, great Alex Randolph, but still number 3 on the worst board game designers of all time. Moving on to number 2, we have James Ernest of Cheap Ass Games, who's made 93 games that are on BoardGameGeek and ranked, and 19 of them are in the bottom 5K. He has 5, however, sitting in the top 3,000, so he's obviously kind of a made man here. And with this one, it's a really interesting because he started this company called Lords of Vegas. It's such a good game. He started this company called Cheap Ass Games, and they used to send out these games all the time that were just in like envelopes. And I wonder how many of these are lowly rated games. Oh yeah, so here's a bunch of those envelopes, as you can see right here. Partially because of the components. Because a lot of times when people judge games, they look at the components directly. If it has bad components and just okay gameplay, I feel like you're a lot more likely to frown on that game. And I imagine skewing the ratings. But hey, anywho, 25. Second place with a bullet. Alex Randolph once again had 19 in the bottom 5,000. James Ernest sitting with 25 out of 93. That's a rough ratio. It's a rough ratio, but once again, made man, 3 in the top, 7 in the top 4,000. Plus, he sold his company to Greater Than Games, so whatevs. He's banking. That's James Ernest. Last honorable mention we have on this list before we get to our number 1 spot. If you're a diehard board gamer, you probably know who's number 1 just from the numbers and the amount of games this person has put out. But I want you to, before we get into that, I want you to take a guess. Take a guess in the comments below who you think is number 1. But right now we're getting to our last honorable mention. We have the mass market crap king, and that is Garrett J. Donner, who's done 52 games that are ranked on BoardGameGeek, and 26 of them, a very impressive half, are in the bottom 5,000. He has 7 in the top 4,000. And Sequence Dice, come on, Sequence Dice is a really... It's not that bad. I like that game. But yeah, he does a lot of like board game spin-off games. So it's like, hey, you want a card game of Farkle? Go get yourself Garrett J. Donner. So he's done a lot of mass market crap. You want a dice version of Skip-Bo? Garrett Donner. You want a game about t-shirts? Bada boom. You know, you want to spin and sorry? You kind of get it. So this is an honorable mention, though, because as I mentioned, I didn't want to consider mass market crap, because I actually own Stinky Pig Game. And my son has had a drastic amount with Stinky Pig Game, and I take offense that it's a 23,000. It has this little pig, and you press his button, and he goes, doo, 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 and then he farts at the end, and then you lose. It's kind of fun if you're a kid. I like it. It was like $4 on Amazon one day. Anywho, moving on to the number one worst game designer of all time, who's also the most prolific game designer of all time and one of the most respected game designers of all time, the Dr. Reiner Knizia, who has won just an incountable number of awards if you're a small child who's not very good at counting, and has put out, it's a stupid amount of games, 353 games that are currently ranked on Boardgamegeek. Yes, you heard that correctly. 353. It is quite absurd. And when you put out 353 games, and those are just the ones that have been ranked, by the way, I believe on his thing it says up to like 600 he's made, you're gonna make quite a few duds, like Fastlane and Motto and Clickbait, which once again, that's the other thing. Party games can kind of get a little bit of a bum rap on BoardGameGeek as well. But he's a made man. He has 24 games in the top 1,000 of all time. That's absurd. He has 2%. Nearly 2.5% of all the games in the top 1,000 of all time. That's ridiculous. 93 games in the top 4,000. He's a 2-time Spiel winner. And, little fun fact, he's 49. He has 49 games down here in the bottom 5,000. But at any second, literally any second, this Ebitz Mitbringspiel sitting at 19,909 could be bumped down, and he will reach the absolutely astounding 50th game in the bottom 5,000, which would mean he would have, what is it? It's not 10%, it's 1%, right? Numbers are hard. Yeah, 1% of all of them. So, yeah, pretty interesting. So there you go. There's the top 10 worst game designers of all time by this metric. And once again, I didn't know another way to really do this, because the thing is, yeah, I mean, if you keep going back here, you'll find a bunch of other games that he made that just didn't get enough ratings. So I think you have to have like 30 or something like that. And so you could say, oh, you could just organize them like that. But then again, you know, some Yahoo with like 4 friends might just all give his prototype a 10, and then that doesn't make it the best game of all time. So I didn't know a better way to do this. But let me know in the comments below what you thought of this list. Who's your least favorite game designer of all time? And if you have any ideas for lists in the future, let me know. Drop them in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the content, please be sure to click on that subscribe button down below, because I gotta tell you, this list was a lot of work. I literally looked through thousands and thousands and thousands of bad games to see, you know, who designed them, and it felt like a giant colossal waste of time. But dang it, now that I'm done with this video, it feels like a little bit less. But as always, thanks for your time, YouTube. Bye bye.